From Sing Sing to Attica, the riot that changed transfers forever. Convoy in the cold. If you think you know prison riots, think again. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and buckle in, because this one changed everything. The convoy's engines rumbled like distant thunder across the frozen upstate New York highway. It was barely dawn, but already news vans were parked at every exit ramp. Plumes of exhaust drifted from their idling generators. Cameras aimed at the narrow ribbon of road where a chain of buses, gray, armored, window slits sealed, snaked toward Sing Sing. Inside, the air was a sour mix of sweat, cold metal, and a fear no one spoke aloud. Shackles clinked each time the buses hit a pothole. Guards in flak jackets sat at the front and back, rifles across their knees. They'd been told this transfer was routine. Nothing about it felt routine. Only 48 hours earlier, the Attica Correctional Facility still bore the scorch marks of America's deadliest prison uprising. 43 people, staff and inmates, were dead, hundreds injured, and the state was desperate to reassert control. The governor's orders had been swift: break up the ringleaders, scatter them across the system, and make an example of anyone suspected of planning the rebellion. More than 600 men were rounded up in the smoke-choked wreckage of the yard, some still in torn uniforms streaked with blood and tear gas residue, others swearing they'd never taken part. By Monday morning, lists were drawn up: Sing Sing, Clinton, Auburn, Greenhaven. Move them fast. No one had calculated what might happen when you pack 100 furious survivors of a massacre onto buses and send them into hostile territory. From the driver's seat of Bus 3, Sergeant James Klein gripped the wheel hard enough to blanch his knuckles. He'd done 20 years of transfers, but never like this. Never after an event that had dominated national headlines for days. He could see the silhouettes of cameras on the overpass ahead, a line of protesters behind the police barricade, holding cardboard signs. Justice for Attica scrawled in red. No more beatings. Remember the dead. As the bus rolled under, something struck the roof. An empty soda can, then another. Not bullets, not yet, but the tension was a live wire. Inside, the prisoners stared straight ahead or muttered under their breath. Some had their heads wrapped in bandages from the retaking of D-Yard. Others had eyes like cold glass, scanning for weaknesses. Among them was Robert "Bobby" Ray Jenkins, a soft-spoken jailhouse lawyer whose handwritten petitions had circulated among inmates for months, urging them to demand an end to solitary confinement. Beside him sat Henry Vance, a former boxer turned jailhouse enforcer who, according to state investigators, had helped seize the hostages in Attica's control room. Whether guilty or scapegoat, both men now wore identical orange jumpsuits marked inmate. Their ankles were chained together, their wrists cuffed to waist chains bolted to the seat frame. They were labeled maximum risk. They were also labeled alive, which, after the weekend, was more than could be said for dozens of others. Klein's radio crackled. "Convoy 1, this is lead. You've got a situation up ahead." Protests spilling onto the road. He tapped his mic. "Copy." Holding formation, his eyes flicked to the rear view. He could see the guard seated across from Jenkins tightening his grip on the shotgun. The atmosphere inside the bus shifted, small movements, like animals sensing an earthquake. Even chained, the men straightened, a tension in their shoulders. They'd been beaten, stripped, photographed, but not broken. And now they were being moved like contraband. The state called it a transfer. The inmates called it the gauntlet. After Attica, stories had already leaked. Men forced to crawl naked across broken glass, beaten with batons as they boarded buses. The Attorney General's office denied everything, but civil rights lawyers were already preparing affidavits. "This is just a shuffle," the governor had told reporters. "Nothing extraordinary." But extraordinary was exactly what it was: the largest mass movement of maximum security prisoners in New York history, under the glare of national media and in the shadow of fresh graves. At the outskirts of Ossining, near the old stone walls of Sing Sing, the convoy slowed. Klein could feel his pulse in his temples. A helicopter hovered above, camera lens glinting. Police cruisers blocked the cross streets, lights strobing blue and red against the snow-mottled asphalt. Ahead, a crowd of off-duty guards' families mingled with activists and reporters, two groups shouting at each other over metal barricades. Some demanded harsher punishment for the killers of Attica. Others demanded an investigation into the slaughter. In the middle of it all, the buses rolled on like ghost ships. Inside Bus 3, Bobby Ray Jenkins closed his eyes. He'd been at Attica since '68, long enough to watch every reform promise dissolve into nothing. He'd written a letter to his sister the week before the riot. "If something happens, tell them we were human." She'd never received it. Guards had confiscated all outgoing mail after the uprising. Now he was headed to Sing Sing, a place rumored to be even more volatile, its death house still intact. Rumor had it the transfer list wasn't just about security, it was about payback. "They'll scatter us where they can break us," another inmate muttered. Jenkins didn't reply. He was watching the guard across the aisle. The man's finger hovered a little too close to the trigger guard. Suddenly, the bus lurched. Outside, a protester had thrown himself into the road, waving a sign. The brakes screeched, chains clattered, someone shouted. In the confusion, a prisoner too rose back, unconfirmed later as Henry Vance, twisted violently against his restraints. A sharp crack followed, like a bone snapping or a weapon slide being racked. The guard shouted, "Sit down." Another voice, "He's got something," then chaos. What happened in those next 30 seconds would become the subject of affidavits, news exposés, and a federal inquiry. Some said an inmate had smuggled a sharpened spoon, hidden in his shoe after the retaking. Others swore a guard's shotgun discharged accidentally. What everyone agreed on was the sound, a deafening blast inside the metal belly of the bus, followed by screams and the stench of burnt powder. Klein slammed the brakes. The convoy shuddered to a halt. Through the frosted window, he could see troopers running from their cruisers, rifles raised, reporters scrambling for cover, flashbulbs popping like lightning. Inside Bus 3, the air turned white with panic. Chains rattled, someone was bleeding, someone else shouting for a medic. The guard across from Jenkins was on the floor, clutching his leg, blood pooling between the steel ribs of the bus. Jenkins stared at his own cuffed hands, then at the weapon sliding across the aisle toward his feet. Outside, the helicopter's camera zoomed in. The image would air that night on every national network. A gray corrections bus stopped on Route 9, troopers crouched behind doors, a swirl of snow and smoke rising from the exhaust. Anchors would call it a transfer gone wrong, the riot after the riot. State officials would insist nothing was amiss. But inside the bus, a decision was being made that would echo through every courtroom hearing for the next decade. Klein's radio hissed, "Lead to Convoy 1. Status." He opened his mouth to answer, but another sound cut him off, a metallic snap, like a lock giving way. The prisoners were still chained, but now there was a weapon between them and the guards, and the road outside was blocked by a crowd screaming for justice. As the camera helicopter banked for a better shot, a single question hung in the icy air, unanswered. Was this a transfer or the spark of a new uprising? Inside the transfer, snow still drifted across Route 9 as sirens wailed from every direction. State police had sealed the road a mile back, but the crowd at the barricade refused to budge. On the buses, everything was a blur of shouting and clattering chains. Troopers outside had no idea who was hurt, who was armed, or whether the uprising had begun again. Sergeant James Klein pressed his shoulder to the doorframe, heart hammering. In training, they'd drilled it into him. Contain, control, call it in. But no one had trained him for 120 furious men chained in a rolling cage, for blood pooling on the floor, or for a TV chopper broadcasting every movement live. He saw the shotgun lying between the seats, a slick trail of blood leading to it. Jenkins's eyes flicked from the weapon to Klein, then back again. "Don't even think about it," Klein hissed. His voice sounded far away, swallowed by the chaos. The bus stank of cordite and iron. Henry Vance sat hunched forward, face pale, cuffs biting into his wrists. A pellet had grazed his ear. The guard on the floor was moaning. A second officer had his hand on his sidearm, but couldn't draw. His seatbelt had jammed in the buckle during the sudden stop. This was the moment civil rights lawyer Alan Goodman would later describe as the crucible in court filings, a convergence of fear, vengeance, and power inside a steel box on wheels. Goodman wasn't there, But affidavits from 4 inmates painted the same picture. Guards screaming contradictory orders, prisoners trying to signal they were still chained, cameras rolling outside as the bus swayed. "Back up! Back up!" another trooper shouted from outside. But the road was too narrow, the convoy hemmed in. For 30 seconds, no one moved. Then Jenkins did something no one expected. He slid the shotgun back across the aisle with his foot until it stopped under the guard's outstretched hand. The guard stared at him, stunned. "Somebody's gonna die if you keep pointing that thing," Jenkins said quietly. His voice carried even over the sirens. "We're chained, man. We can't go anywhere." It was a small act, but it shifted the current. The second guard finally freed his pistol and holstered it. He crouched to help his partner. Klein exhaled and keyed his mic. "Convoy 1, situation contained. Need EMS now." Outside, the troopers moved in, weapons ready. A medic boarded, ducking under the low ceiling, and began dressing the guard's wound. He would survive. No prisoners had been shot, though 3 bore fresh bruises from the panic. In the crush of rumors that followed, the press would report an escape attempt. Activists would call it a staged provocation. Neither story was true. But the myth of a second riot was born that morning, before the buses even rolled again. When the convoy finally reached Sing Sing's old stone gates 2 hours later, the temperature had dropped into the teens. Reporters pressed against the police line, shouting questions. Were inmates beaten? Was there a weapon? Is it true one of the leaders tried to hijack the bus? Troopers hustled them back. Inside the prison's receiving area, the new arrivals were herded off the buses one by one. The transfer orders, stamped emergency, left no room for dispute. Many were still in the same clothes they'd worn during the Attica retaking, torn denim, soot on their collars. A line of prison nurses checked them for weapons and injuries. A second line of guards photographed them, snapping Polaroids under harsh fluorescence. Some men flinched at the flash. The state's strategy was simple: scatter and silence. Send suspected organizers to far-flung maximums where they'd be isolated, cut off from allies, and, officially, evaluated for security needs. What the officials underestimated was the power of the press and the courts. Within days, stories of the convoy's chaos would leak to the New York Times and the Village Voice. Photographs of inmates with bandaged heads and purple bruises would appear on front pages. The narrative of the riot after the riot would harden into a national scandal. At the heart of it was a single question: how had so many men been injured during what the Department of Correctional Services called a routine transfer? Civil rights attorneys filed emergency motions, demanding federal oversight of prisoner transport. The governor's press secretary dismissed it as baseless. But inside Sing Sing, Bobby Ray Jenkins sat on the edge of his new bunk, already drafting another petition. He'd been assigned to C Block, a high-security tier with steel mesh running to the ceiling. The smell of bleach and old stone clung to everything. From his cell window, he could see the Hudson River, gray and choppy under the winter sky. The last time he'd been moved was 1969. Back then, he believed transfers meant a chance at a fresh start. Now he knew better. Across the tier, Henry Vance nursed his ear with a damp cloth. He was angrier than Jenkins had ever seen him. "They're not done with us," he muttered through the bars. "They'll say we tried to escape. They'll use it to bury us in the box." The box was the special housing unit, solitary confinement. After Attica, rumors swirled that whole groups would be sent there indefinitely under investigative status. No hearings, no charges, just a cell the size of a bathroom for 23 hours a day. Down the hall, a guard barked orders. New arrivals were being lined up for medical evaluations. One by one, men were stripped, photographed again, and interrogated about their role in the uprising. Some were told they could avoid solitary if they cooperated. Others were asked for names. Everyone knew what that meant. That night, as the prison quieted, Jenkins wrote by the dim light of his cell, "We were moved under color of law, but treated like spoils of war." This transfer is an extension of Attica. He wasn't sure anyone would ever read it, but someone was reading. Alan Goodman had a contact inside Sing Sing, a chaplain who slipped him letters from inmates. When Goodman saw Jenkins's note, he recognized an opening. The state had made a crucial error. By moving hundreds of men en masse under emergency orders, it had exposed itself to federal jurisdiction. Prisoners in transit had rights under interstate commerce and civil rights statutes that stationary inmates did not. It was a thin wedge, but Goodman knew how to drive wedges. He filed for an emergency injunction in federal court, demanding access to the transfer logs, medical records, and any use of force reports. The state refused. The judge scheduled a hearing anyway. Back inside Sing Sing, tension simmered. Guards whispered about the troublemakers from Attica. Inmates whispered about the snitches. Everyone waited for the hammer to fall. Then, 3 days after the convoy, it did. At dawn, teams of officers in riot gear swept through C Block. Doors clanged open. Names were called. Jenkins and Vance were both yanked from their cells, cuffed, and led down a corridor smelling of disinfectant and old sweat. They were not told where they were going. As they passed the administration wing, Jenkins caught a glimpse of a bulletin board covered in grainy black and white photographs. The faces of Attica's alleged ringleaders, each with a red X drawn across it. His own photo was in the middle. They were marched to the basement, to a small room lined with cinder block and a single table. 2 men in suits waited, badges clipped to their belts. Not guards. Not prison officials. "Mr. Jenkins," one said. "Mr. Vance. We're with the State Investigations Commission. We have some questions." Jenkins felt his stomach knot. Outside the tiny windowless room, the sound of boots on tile echoed like distant drums. He realized, with a chill, that the transfer wasn't over. It had only just begun. The hearing. The snow outside Sing Sing had turned to a hard gray crust by the time the subpoenas landed on the warden's desk. The papers were crisp and clinical. United States District Court, Southern District of New York. Emergency hearing on alleged abuse of prisoners in transit. The state's attorneys called it political theater. The warden called it a headache. But to the men on C Block, it felt like the first crack in a wall they'd thought was unbreakable. In a cramped basement room far from the cameras, Bobby Ray Jenkins sat cuffed to a metal chair, a state investigator's tape recorder on the table between them. The fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead. For hours the questions had looped. Did you lead the takeover? Who planned the hostages? Did you try to seize a weapon on the bus? Jenkins kept answering the same way. No plan. No weapon. We were chained. Each answer earned a new look, a new scribble of a pen. Henry Vance sat in the corner, his jaw tight, a dried bloodstain still at his collar. What Jenkins didn't know was that 90 miles away, Alan Goodman was already on his feet in a federal courtroom, holding up a photograph taken through the bus window. It showed the guard bleeding, the prisoners still shackled, hands visible. "This is not an escape attempt," he told the judge. "This is a rolling crime scene." Reporters scribbled furiously. A wire service photographer snapped a shot of Goodman mid-gesture, finger pointed like an accusation. The image would run in papers from Albany to Los Angeles the next morning. State lawyers pushed back hard. They argued the prisoners were violent conspirators, that restraints had been loosened for medical reasons, that the bus incident was exaggerated. But under questioning, they admitted something else. No official use of force reports had been filed for the convoy. "Why not?" the judge asked. "Because it was a transport, not an incident," the assistant attorney general replied. The gallery murmured. Goodman smiled thinly. The door had opened. Back at Sing Sing, word of the hearings spread like contraband. Men passed it cell to cell on scraps of paper, whispered it through the plumbing. "The feds are coming," one inmate told another. "They can't hide it now." Guards scowled but said nothing. Even some of them had started to question how the transfer had been handled. They'd been told it was routine, then ordered into buses packed with men fresh from tear gas and beatings. A few had quietly contacted Goodman themselves. On the second day of testimony, the first trooper from the convoy took the stand. His voice shook as he described the moment the shotgun went off. They were chained. All of them. We panicked. A hush fell over the courtroom. The next witness, a medic, confirmed that several prisoners had untreated injuries from Attica when they boarded the bus. No stretchers, no real medical staff, just orders to move them fast, he said. The judge's expression hardened. Meanwhile, in the cinderblock interview room, Jenkins was given a choice. Cooperate with the investigation, provide names, detail the planning of the uprising, and he might avoid indefinite solitary. Refuse, and he'd rot in the box. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that threat. He stared at the two men in suits and said nothing. Vance shifted in his chair, but also stayed silent. Outside the door, boots moved in the hall. The moment stretched. Later, as they were led back to their cells, Jenkins caught a glimpse of the prison chapel through an open door. Inside, the chaplain was on the phone, voice low, eyes darting toward the hall. It was the same chaplain who'd smuggled Jenkins's note to Goodman. Jenkins realized the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proof. 2 nights later, the Hudson Valley was lashed by an ice storm. Power flickered, and the prison went on backup generators. In the darkened tiers, guards moved by flashlight. Somewhere down the corridor, a door slammed, echoing like a gunshot. Inmates muttered in their bunks, unsure if a raid was underway. In the chaos, an envelope slid under Jenkins's cell door. He picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. The bus stopped on Route 9, troopers crouched behind their cruisers, snow swirling. On the back, in a neat hand, someone had written, "Chain of custody. Protect this." It was evidence, real, physical evidence, showing what the state wanted buried. How it had gotten into his cell was a mystery. The chaplain? A sympathetic guard? Someone higher up trying to hedge bets? Jenkins hid the photo under his mattress. Vance watched silently, eyes wide. "You know what that is?" he whispered. "That's your life insurance." The next morning, federal marshals arrived at Sing Sing with a writ granting them access to the transferred inmates. The warden tried to block them, citing security concerns. The judge's order was clear: interviews, medical exams, photographs. Guards lined the hallways, tension buzzing like static. For the first time since Attica, the balance of power tilted, if only slightly. The men who had been moved like contraband were now potential witnesses in a civil rights investigation. But the state wasn't finished. As Goodman built his case, mysterious disciplinary reports began appearing in prisoners' files. Accusations of contraband, threats, escape plots. Each one could justify solitary confinement or a transfer to an even harsher unit. It was a classic tactic: smear the witness, bury him in paperwork, keep him out of reach. Goodman pushed back, filing motion after motion, but the clock was ticking. Jenkins felt it in his bones. Each night, he lay awake in his cell, the Hudson wind rattling the bars, thinking about the photograph under his mattress. It wasn't just a picture. It was a fuse. If it reached the right hands, the state's narrative would collapse. If it was found, he'd be labeled a snitch and disappear into the box. He started passing coded messages through the chapel, arranging a way to get the photo out. Meanwhile, Vance began to crack. He'd been beaten at Attica, nearly shot on the bus, now facing endless solitary. One night, he whispered to Jenkins, "Maybe they're right. Maybe we don't win this." Jenkins stared at the dark ceiling. "We don't have to win," he said softly. "We just have to be heard." Jenkins sat on the edge of the bunk, fists clenched, heart hammering. Outside, the ice storm rattled against the window. Somewhere down the corridor, a man screamed as his door clanged shut in solitary. In the flicker of the backup lights, Jenkins saw his own breath. The proof was gone. The case might collapse, and the state still held all the keys. But as the door locked behind the search team, a guard lingered a moment too long, then slipped a small folded note through the bars. For words, written in pencil, "Check the chapel floor." Jenkins's pulse quickened. He realized the game wasn't over yet. 2 days later, the judge issued a bombshell order. The state must produce the transfer logs, medical records, and all photographs taken during the convoy. The courtroom erupted. Reporters ran for the payphones. On the tier, word spread before the guards could stop it. Men banged on their bars, shouting through the roar of the generators. For a moment, hope flickered like the weak emergency lights overhead. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. That evening, a team of officers entered Jenkins's cell. They said it was a random search. They turned over his mattress, rifled his papers, searched every corner. When they left, the photo was gone. Chain of custody. The chapel door opened on a draft of cold river air and floor polish. Morning light filtered through the high, dusty windows, striping the pews in chalky rectangles. A guard stood at the back, arms folded, watching the handful of men who filed in and took their places. Somewhere in the prison, a steam pipe banged 3 times, like a muted warning. Bobby Ray Jenkins slid into the last pew, kept his eyes on the scuffed hymnals, and waited until the shuffle of boots receded down the hall. He felt rather than saw the chaplain ease into the row ahead of him. The man's collar was askew, his hands shaking just enough to rattle the thin pages of his Bible. Jenkins glanced at the floor. At first, he saw nothing but old varnish and a scatter of grit. Then he noticed it. One tile whose corner didn't sit flush, a triangle of darkness visible beneath. For words had brought him here. Check the chapel floor. And now, every nerve taut, he slid his shoe beneath the lip and pried. The tile came up with a soft crack. Beneath, in a pocket just deep enough for a book, lay a manila envelope bound with twine. No markings. No return address. Jenkins felt his mouth go dry. He pushed the tile carefully back into place, slid the envelope into his waistband, and closed his eyes. The guard at the door shifted, cleared his throat, and stepped into the aisle. "Wrap it up, Reverend," he barked. "Administration wants this space in 10. The chaplain nodded without turning. He began an unsteady prayer, something about mercy for the dead and justice for the living, while Jenkins breathed through a storm of adrenaline. When the last amen faded, the chaplain stood, face pale but composed, and reached back as if to steady himself on the pew. His fingers brushed Jenkins's sleeve, a tiny, human contact that said everything and nothing. Back in C Block, Jenkins hid the package in the slit of foam under his mattress and sat, fists clenched, listening to the corridor. The prison moved in pulses, keys, boots, doors, silence, and he timed his breath to it until the urge to rip the envelope open subsided. When the tears settled to a low hum, he worked the twine loose and slid the contents onto his bunk. There were 4 items. First, a carbon copy of a transfer manifest, faint purple letters listing names, DOC numbers, injuries noted at intake, and a margin scrawl. Per directive, no supplemental report. Move fast. Second, a small strip of photographic negatives curled like a centipede. He held them to the light. The convoy, the bus, the troopers crouched behind their cruisers, the smear of blood inside. Image after image, freeze-framing the rumor into something that could survive cross-examination. Third, a memo on state letterhead, stamped draft and signed. It was brief, terrifyingly clean. Given current climate, all transport incidents classified as operational turbulence, not force events. No external filing without central authorization. 2 lines below, avoid photography by press. Internal photography for identification only. Fourth, wrapped in tissue like a relic, a cassette tape. On the plastic window, a piece of labeling tape. Route 9, Bus 3, 0717 HRS. Jenkins stared at it. His heart hammered in his throat. He had no player, no way to hear it. But the weight of the cassette felt like proof you could hold in your palm. He rewrapped it and slid everything back into the envelope, then into the foam again, then lay flat on the bunk with his elbows jutting, as if he were just another man trying to sleep through steel. He lasted all of 10 minutes. Then he tapped the wall twice with his knuckles. 2 taps came back. Vance's whisper filtered through the vent. "You get it. I got it, Jenkins breathed. It's real. Who's it from? I don't know. He didn't. But that night, while the Hudson wind needled through the leaky window, a picture formed. The guard who'd lingered at his door after the search. The note that said check the chapel floor. The steady pair of hands that had passed his earlier letter to a lawyer. The medic's frank testimony. It wasn't one person. It was a fragile chain of people who'd decided, at various lengths from the fire, that this time the truth might be worth the risk. The problem was getting the chain out. The federal marshals were scheduled to return in 2 days with a doctor and a photographer. The warden had protested. The judge had made an order. In the meantime, Jenkins knew he was living inside a ticking clock. Random cell searches were never random. The envelope made him fuse. The chaplain arrived again at noon, asking in a voice half whisper, half prayer, if any men wanted communion. 7 hands went up. The guard at the door checked his watch and waved them through the gate one at a time. The chaplain's eyes flicked once to Jenkins, then away. When the wafer touched his tongue, Jenkins smelled coffee on the chaplain's breath, and something else, the faint paper and ink ghost that clinged to a copy room. Brother, the chaplain murmured so softly it was almost thought, tomorrow, when the marshals come, the warden will stage a drill. What kind of drill? Jenkins kept his lips barely moving. Evacuation. Fire or a fight. It'll break up the interviews. Delay chain of custody. Keep your head. The guard cleared his throat. Communion was over. The room emptied like a tide going out. Jenkins didn't sleep. He paced mental routes from C block to the infirmary, to the chapel, to the admin wing. He watched the clock. At 3 a.m., a door slammed and a man sobbed. At 4 a.m., the boiler kicked and coughed, making the floor hum. At 5 a.m., keys scraped and the lights snapped up harsh and bright. The marshals arrived just after 8, their windbreakers salt-stained, faces pinched against the cold. With them came Alan Goodman, his thin hands jammed into the pockets of a cheap coat and an expression like a man who has learned to sleep standing up between courtrooms. The warden met them at the gate, his smile brittle. Papers shuffled, orders were produced, stares were traded. Then the procession moved, through the sally port, down the echoing halls, toward the multipurpose room where the interviews would happen beneath a sagging basketball hoop. Jenkins watched from his cell as the column passed, his breath suspended in a glassy, hopeless hope. One of the marshals looked up at the tiers, expression unreadable. A guard barked, eyes front, and the guard's voice doubled in the tiled space, then thinned, then was gone. C block was called in groups. When Jenkins's turn came, a sergeant with a brown mustache and tired eyes snapped the cuffs on and walked him at a brisk pace. The sergeant's hand trembled where it rested lightly on Jenkins's upper arm. When they reached the multipurpose room, the noise surprised him most. The low thrum of voices, the scratch of pens, the steady metronome of a tape recorder. Every few minutes, paper cracked as someone tore a Polaroid from its backing. Goodman looked older than his photographs, in the way people age between headlines. He glanced up, saw Jenkins, and for a moment the lines around his eyes softened. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, and the "Mr." felt like a warm thing placed gently into a cold hand. "I'd like to ask you about the bus." They sat. A marshal leaned against the wall, a quiet mountain. The warden's deputy hovered, frowning. A guard positioned himself within arm's reach of the door. The tape recorder clicked and whirred. "Tell me what happened at 0717, Goodman said. Jenkins told him about the helicopter, the crowd, the slamming of brakes, the blast, the guard's leg, the weapon sliding, the way he'd pushed it back. He kept it clean, short declaratives, a rhythm of facts. He didn't mention the envelope. Not yet. Halfway through his account, the alarm went off. It wasn't the fire bell, too low, too insistent, and not the riot siren either, which he had learned to distinguish as a man learns the tones of a lover's voice. It was the building evacuation warning, the one they used for pipe bursts and false alarms. The deputy warden straightened like a man hit with a cattle prod. "We have to clear this room," he announced. "Now." In the instant of indecision that followed, The colors in the room seemed to grow denser. The oil-stained mat of the gym floor, the chalk scuffs beneath the hoop, Goodman's red-rimmed eyes. The marshal spoke for the first time. Judge's order stands. Interviews continue unless there's immediate danger. The deputy warden stared at him. Boots thudded in the hall. A radio chattered. Drill. Drill. Repeat, drill. The deputy warden hissed between his teeth. Fine, he said, but keep them moving. 10 minutes apiece. They had already lost half the day. Jenkins leaned in. I have something, he said to Goodman. Not a flourish. A statement as bald as a stone. You'll need chain of custody. Goodman did not blink. He opened his legal pad and wrote, in a doctor's rapid scrawl. Where? How? Who knows? Then he slid the pad closer so Jenkins could read without moving his head. The guard at the door watched them like a coyote in high grass. Chapel, Jenkins said softly. Floor. His heart beat so hard he thought it would rattle his chain. Goodman capped his pen. I'm requesting access to the chapel immediately for evidentiary review, he said to the deputy warden, his tone turning mild in the way of a knife that has learned manners. We have reason to believe photographs from the transport are stored there improperly. Absolutely not, the deputy snapped. Religious spaces are outside the scope. The marshal coughed. It's inside the scope, he said. Orders clear. The deputy warden flushed, then smiled without warmth. We'll get you into the chapel, he said. After lunch. After lunch meant after the drill, after the shakedown, after the relief shift, after the day had been strangled. Jenkins felt dread pool in his stomach. If they searched C Block in the next hour and found the envelope, it wouldn't matter if Goodman brought the Supreme Court to the chapel doors. We'll need it now, Goodman said, before anything else happens in this facility today. The deputy warden's radio hissed like an angry cat. He pressed it to his mouth, whispered, listened. When he looked up, his expression had been wiped clean. Fine, he said. 10 minutes. No photos. My staff stays. The chapel was colder than the block. Their footsteps on the wood set the air shivering. The chaplain stood at the altar, his hands clasped too tightly, his knuckles white as chalk. He nodded once to Goodman, once to Jenkins, and then pretended to be absorbed in a stack of hymnals. The guard at the door took up his post as if he had grown there overnight. Where? Goodman asked. Jenkins walked to the pew, eased the tile up with the heel of his hand, and reached into the dark. He lifted the envelope like a newborn bird and set it carefully on the polished wood. The deputy warden made an involuntary sound in his throat. The marshal stepped forward and snapped on gloves. Chain of custody begins now, the marshal said, and Jenkins felt a strange, violent relief, like a knot loosening without permission. They did it right. Latex, evidence bag, initials in blue ink, timestamp. The deputy warden watched, lips pressed thin, as the marshal logged each item. Manifest carbon, memo draft, negatives, cassette tape. Where did this come from? The deputy asked, each word clipped and deadly. Goodman didn't look up. From inside your facility, he said. From under your floor. From your conscience, if you still have one. He gestured to the chaplain without turning his head. Pastor, you may want to step away from this moment. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, the chaplain whispered. The drill came anyway. 15 minutes later, as they walked the corridor back toward the multipurpose room, the lights cut out and an electronic voice began its grim mantra. Maintain order. Maintain order. Maintain order. Doors clanged elsewhere, a cascade of iron. The deputy warden barked into his radio. Somewhere, water hammered through pipes as if the building itself were trying to flee. Back to your units, a sergeant shouted, and the hallway became a stream of bodies moving in two directions at once. Guards bunching toward the disturbance, inmates funneling away under orders, marshals anchoring like boulders in floodwater. In the confusion, Jenkins lost sight of the envelope. Then he saw it again in the marshal's gloved hand, the plastic evidence bag shimmering like a fish's flank under the emergency lights. He watched it the way a man watches the last train he will ever see. They put it back in his cell and slammed the door. For an hour, the prison was a sandstorm. Then, suddenly quiet. The drill had moved the pieces, but the board remained. In the afternoon, interviews resumed. That evening, the marshals left with the bag in a gray case handcuffed to a wrist. The memo hit the papers 2 days later, the draft making operational turbulence of blood and bone, and the photograph after that, black and white, grain sharp as a scream. A guard bleeding, inmates chained, a shotgun glinting on painted steel. The tape came last, after a judge agreed to a limited release. In a hiss and pop of cheap cassette, a voice recorded on the morning of the convoy said what the memos tried not to say. Keep it moving. No paperwork till Albany weighs in. I don't care what you call it, just keep the press away. If there's an incident, it's a transport irregularity, not a use of force. Copy, copy, another voice said. Then a third voice, lower, more human and closer to the microphone, said, they're chained. All of them. We need a medic. That third voice would become the pivot in every analysis, the human hinge that swung a bureaucracy into the realm of men. When it was finally matched to a name, weeks later, it wasn't a prisoner's. It was Sergeant James Klein. He hadn't meant to become a witness. The recorder had been for his shift log, a habit picked up after a lawsuit years earlier. He'd forgotten it was on during the convoy's tightest turns. That morning, in the panic on Bus 3, he had crouched by a bleeding officer and radiated the need for medics while cameras buzzed overhead and a nation fed on rumor. He had filed no report because he'd been told not to. He had kept the tape because something in him had understood, before judges and journalists and God, that the sound of his own voice might matter. His wife would later tell a reporter that he hadn't slept for 3 days after he sent the copy to the chaplain. He stopped sleeping again when the story broke. He received anonymous calls at odd hours, the whisper of a line and breath. When he was called to testify, he stood alone before a paneled wall and told the truth in the flat voice of a man who has decided the truth will have to be enough. The fallout didn't fix everything. It never does. But it did set into motion the changes the story had always been about. The Department of Correctional Services rewrote its transport policies in language that sounded simple and was hard-won. Medical clearance before movement, photographic documentation by medical staff, not just security, mandatory use of force reports even when incidents occur in transit, unbroken chain of custody for any evidence gathered en route, an independent observer on high-risk convoys whenever possible. Cameras, official ones, were assigned to transport details. And a governor who had called the transfer nothing extraordinary signed a directive that made extraordinary the baseline. Not everyone lived to see it. Henry Vance didn't testify. He didn't trust the courts, didn't trust the marshals, didn't trust breath. When they offered him protective custody, he laughed until his eyes watered. A month after the hearing, he was transferred to Clinton Correctional and placed in the special housing unit on investigative status. He wrote one letter to Jenkins from the box, 10 lines of upright block letters on the back of a commissary form, and then fell silent. Years later, an upstate paper would note his name in a paragraph about a man found unresponsive in a solitary cell during a heat wave. Cause of death, undetermined. True or not, the rumor stuck to the truth like ash. The chaplain was reassigned to a downstate facility and retired soon after with a pension that made him blush. He kept his head down, learned the names of the trees along the river, and never answered questions about the floor. In his desk at home, under a worn copy of the Psalms, he kept a photocopy of the memo with a paperclip crease where his thumb had worried it while he prayed. Alan Goodman became what he had been training to be, a careful custodian of other people's pain. He ran the case past exhaustion, into settlements and consent decrees, into those incremental victories that never look like victories until you stack them and see they've made a step. And Jenkins? He got a hearing, then another. The commissioners asked him about the bus, about the photo, about the tape with Sergeant Klein's voice. They wanted to know whether he had cooperated or merely been present. He told them he had been present, and he had told the truth, and he had pushed a weapon back to the hands of the man who had pointed it at him because he had wanted to live to write one more letter. Parole denied. He was transferred again, then again, then settled into a routine of waking early, writing longhand, and sharing his commissary coffee with men who had less. On the 10th anniversary of the convoy, a new warden hung a framed policy on the wall of Sing Sing's transport office. It was a checklist, sturdy and unromantic. The younger officers called it the Klein sheet, though the paper didn't bear his name. Before any bus rolled, a medic checked a box. A camera checked another. A lieutenant signed his initials next to the words, "Use of force reports mandatory, even in transit." The officers grumbled, as officers will, about paperwork. Then they checked the boxes and the buses rolled, and most days nobody bled on the floor. In the river light of early morning, if you stood by the gate and watched a convoy pull out, you could see the small differences that are the only differences that ever last. An extra medic in the second vehicle. A battered Pelican case for evidence strapped to the wall of the lead bus. A sergeant touching his breast pocket, confirming the recorder was on, not to catch anyone, but to make sure the room always had a memory. Once, years after the hearing, Jenkins was called to the chapel by a new chaplain who had inherited the old one's keys. The tile still popped when he pried it, though the pocket below was empty. They had replaced the floor twice since the scandal. The pocket was a ghost they could not board over. The chaplain asked him to speak to a few younger men about patience. Jenkins said patience without purpose is just waiting, and he was tired of waiting. He told them to write, to witness, to pass the photograph along when their hands were steady enough to carry it through a crowd. On the day Sergeant Klein retired, no one made a speech. He turned in his badge and his ring of keys and a radio that still had a strip of masking tape across the battery compartment with Route 9 ghosting through the dust. He shook hands with the men who would replace him and said to one of them, "If it happens again, remember they're chained." The young man blinked, not understanding, and Klein let it go. Outside, he stood for a long minute with his palm flat on the warm hood of his car, as if to ground himself in something that wasn't iron. The press moved on. The public moved on faster. The story shrank, then evaporated, then came back as a lecture in a law school classroom, as a line in a footnote, as a cautionary tale whispered at shift change. It lived where all hard-won reforms live, in paper and muscle memory and the fragile courage of people who do not want to be heroes. And yet the echo of that winter morning on Route 9 never quite left the building. It was there when a young medic climbed onto a bus one February and checked a man's pulse before the wheels rolled. It was in the pause a lieutenant took before he wrote incident instead of irregularity. It was in the way a chaplain kept his office unlocked during lunch, just in case a man needed a quiet place to think. Years after, a reporter tracked Jenkins down for a piece about the riot that changed transfers forever. She had read the consent decrees, interviewed Goodman, filed FOIAs, and walked the corridor where the cassette had changed hands. She asked the question that had been gnawing at her since her editor pitched the story. Did it matter? Jenkins looked at the river, which was the same color it had been the morning he hid the envelope under his mattress. He said they still move men in chains. The buses still roll before dawn. But there's a camera now. There's a medic. There's a report with a name on it. When something goes wrong, there's a place to put the truth beside your chest. She waited, pen hovering. And sometimes, he added, that's enough to keep a man alive long enough to tell it. That night, a bus left the downstate gate at 4:12 a.m. in a numb black rain. Inside, the cuffs clicked, the engine hummed, the medic counted gauze. A sergeant hit record on a small digital device, checked the red light, and then, as the convoy turned onto the highway where 1,000 stories start and end, he spoke softly into the cloth hush. All parties restrained. Medical clear. Beginning transport. The tape would be archived and might never be played because the transport would be uneventful, and uneventful is the kind of miracle nobody notices. But if you listen close between the hum of tires and the sweep of wipers, you could hear another sound, the kind that keeps certain rooms from becoming tombs. The click of a box being checked before the harm, the flutter of paper becoming memory, the faint, stubborn pulse of accountability. And somewhere in a newsroom, in a courtroom, in the back pew of a chapel that smelled of lemon oil and dust, or in a room where a man with a pencil and a bad back wrote another petition by hand. The photograph still existed, cold and factual as winter light. A bleeding guard, chained men, a weapon pushed back across a floor. You could look at it and see a riot that tried to grow its second head and failed. You could look at it and see the beginning of a chain that did not break. Or you could look at it and see what Sergeant James Klein meant the first time he said the truest sentence he ever spoke. They're chained. All of them. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.